Nina Power, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, John.
Well, it's my pleasure to host you in this digital ethereal realm, and there are a few people who follow and watch the show that when I put the obligatory tweet out to say Nina Power confirmed on the show, that people were quite excited and said, oh, this is going to be interesting as we at least unpack and talk about some of the strands, even though that's the wrong word to use, in the cultural zeitgeist out there. And you certainly always have interesting takes, as I was saying before we pressed record, on things. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say on a few matters. And I thought we could begin with a conversation which I know you have been a part of on previous podcasts and in your writings, but also as it bubbled back to the surface this week through the philosopher John Gray, and that's about what comes after liberalism, if liberalism as we know it is indeed dead. And you have hypothesized about what might come after the individual, the age of the individual. And John Gray says that he's not a post-liberal. He thinks the only thing that can save Britain is actually a Hobbesian liberalism where there's a strong state to reduce the tensions between competing groups, of which we have many now across ethnic and religious and ideological lines, and doesn't believe that salvation lies in any of the post-liberal visions, whether it's the left conservative vision of Blue Labour or the SDP or Catholic integralism or Anglo-futurism and all the rest of it. He says we're stuck with the individual. And in some senses, he's right, because the English, for as long as we know, and as anthropologists can say, there's always been a strong sense of the individual and liberty, and that was bolstered by the arrival of Christianity. And I suppose if the universalized liberal coda, like the one that has been exported across the world through empire and all the rest of it, is done, where do we think we're going? Can we return back to the cultural traits of the English people and live as individuals without the individualism of consumer culture and all the rest of it? Or are the big demographic changes, the tidal wave coming our way, where there's a minority of English people in the country, mean that can't really happen? Where do you stand on that brain fog that I've just put out into the ether there?
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. And I read the John Gray piece very carefully, as well as Sebastian Milbank's response to it in the Critic, and also various takes on criticisms of post-liberalism by Pimlico Journal, who I think are sort of maybe a bit more younger, kind of Zoomer thinkers. And yeah, I mean, in a way, I think my position on this is sort of somewhat moderate, surprisingly. But I do think, I mean, I am taken by some of the post-liberal diagnosis, and I see a lot of the post-liberal work as an analysis and a diagnosis rather than necessarily any substantive plans, although it's also read like that. Sometimes people use post-liberalism also just to mean whatever comes next, if you see what I mean, and that could be for good or ill. But yeah, I mean, so John Gray's position really is a kind of defense of a certain kind of liberal pluralism that is predicated on the idea of a sort of strong state. But that, yeah, he argues, I think particularly the Anglo or the English are fundamentally individualistic, or have been for a very long time. And this is a thesis also in Alan McFarlane's book from the late 70s, and that, and it is borne out in terms of a certain national character, adventurism, exploration, leaving the country, never looking back. All of our great eccentrics and playwrights and poets and so on, that there is this sort of perhaps eccentricity and all of those things that we would very much want to defend. And in any case, I mean, John Gray is sort of saying, well, we can't really go back, like the idea that we can all go and live in obscure Scottish fishing communities and live in a communitarian way is just not viable, right? We live in major cities, we live in the modern world, and all of these things. And I think in Sebastian Milbank's piece for the Critic, he points out that actually, well, you can have liberal states that are economically liberal, like Singapore and Dubai, but they're actually extremely anti-liberal in other ways, right? Restrictions on speech and very strict laws and so on and so forth. So you can obviously take strains of liberalism and do them in a particular way. I think one of the roads not taken would have been a sort of a robust defense of liberalism. And I think the figure here for me is not actually a British person, but a Dutch one. This guy Pim Fortuyn, who you might remember, was assassinated
mm,
like 20 years ago, who very much was saying, I mean, that well, actually, look, the West has got to this point where we have um, gay rights, we have feminism, we have a certain sort of commitment to these values, and they're specific liberal values for whatever set of reasons, post-Christian, historical contingent developments. But like here we are, and that we should defend those, and that actually importing people who are very much opposed to those positions, right? Who think that by virtue of scripture or religious belief that those things are evils, in fact, that should be punished, is potentially a really, really bad idea, and that the
mm,
West should defend those liberal values, qua liberal values. And of course, he was killed for this position by a sort of deranged leftist, animal rights activist, and he was accused of being kind of neo-Nazi, right wing, and so on. But in retrospect, Fortuyn's position looks quite moderate, actually, simply pointing out that there really are quite different belief systems, quite different worldviews, and that they are potentially incompatible. And I think this idea of
mm,
pluralism, yes, I mean, in a way, you could say, well, perhaps up to like the 90s or so around then, that there was a process of assimilation. There was a way in which you could bring in other people without diluting the national character. People could sort of join it and belong to it and embrace those values. Indeed, I know many people who have, and in a way are more British than some of the British in a way, by by
mm,
by being kind of totally on board with the project. That's obviously not the situation we find ourselves in now. That said, I do think that, I agree with Patrick Deneen when he says things like in his work on liberalism that actually liberalism um, failed because it succeeded, which is to say, well, actually, we went so far with this kind of liberal individualism that actually you might end up thinking, well, actually, the drug addict and the mad person are the most liberal subjects because they're the most individuated in some ways, right? They're following their desire. They've got their own position on the world. But actually, these are not good things, right? These are people who are
mm,
fundamentally alone in the world, who are sort of broken, that their relation to the social is torn. And so I do think we've gone way too far down a certain kind of consumerist liberal individualism, if you want, that actually is heartbreaking in reality, that
mm,
people do need families, communities, and so on and so forth. And just personally, I've made an awful lot of efforts to, um, I don't know, integrate myself into like my local community, my local church. I have a good relation with my family. I've dealt with addiction issues and so on and so forth. And I think I think people do need to be sociable, and I'm very worried
mm,
about people who are, if you like, Hobbes's wolf. And when Hobbes talks about, man is a wolf to man, homo homine lupus est, he in many ways is talking about the melancholic, the desocialized or the asocial person who is outside of any feeling of belonging. And that
mm,
might work for the odd extreme outlier adventurer who sees the world as a place to I don't know, to live in this very autonomous way. But I actually don't think that works for most people. I think if you ask people what they care about, they'll say their family, their friends, where they live, their community, their hobbies, and so on. So
mm,
somewhere in the middle. But I wouldn't want to stop like the eccentric. I think we should also love and encourage our eccentrics and not punish them. Uh not
mm,
have a homogenous society in which everybody thinks the same and so on. But I mean, I think without kind of religious and moral influence, um, just a desire-based world is actually untenable. It's unlivable for most people.
mm. I think you're absolutely right, and I've seen it personally. in two levels, one with a close family member and one with myself, though to a much lesser extent, thankfully. But with myself, I found right up until my late 20s, having been inculcated into this a historical worldview of the country and just had it, all implanted in me about. I suppose there's the guilt aspects, but also just a general a bit of generalizing about the country, but also knowing very little about my local and regional background, and also being part of a family that was ridiculously nuclear in that there was basically no extended family around. And it wasn't until my late 20s that I actually managed to connect properly, fully with the region that I was from, that I actually understood some of the key figures. We're talking about region builders, nation builders, religion builders, things to start feeling proud of, and also to find out about my own family connections, where I hailed from, all of those things, my heritage. And suddenly I felt part of something, having, I think, looking back, I was able to say I just was kind of moving around like this little atom by myself. And I know, given all of the bad decisions I made, that it was partly because I was just totally nihilistic. I was brought up
Mm.
without any kind of religious or moral or cultural ballast to hold on to, and certainly nothing. There was no cultural belonging there either, which I think is hugely important. And then within my close family member, I've also seen the very destructive angle to it, where you've ran your career. It's been all about ultimately providing for the family, which is great, but it's been moving through the checkposts of the career, but losing all of those connections along the way, and in the end being left alone with none of those things that have been nurtured over time, and it's been totally destructive. And I think, besides the personal anecdotes, I think this is probably what's behind a lot of the mental health stuff we see, with the exception of, we know the technology is like an acid for our mind, but we also know that people just have way less people time. And even being English, knowing that we're highly individualistic, is, in the past, there was still civic society, and there are remnants of
Yeah.
it. We see the ghosts of it everywhere we walk around. We see old women's institutes. We see those churches which are converting into nice houses. We see so many different elements of what was once a thriving civic society. Jubilee halls, which are now more houses and all the rest of it, or holiday homes. And it's it's to say that you can be both an individualistic culture whilst having a civic society and needing one. And I suppose on that basis, Nina, let's think about where we're at then as a country. So one thing I've noticed a lot entering the discourse, and maybe it's just because the internet circles that I'm operating in, but you notice lots of references to Lord of the Rings and how there is a scouring of the Shire, and often it's with regards to what we're seeing in the communities that were previously less affected by mass immigration or legal immigration. They're talking about orcs being in the Shires because of the rapes and the murders and all the rest of it. But also, when Labour came to power last year, I remember thinking, oh, this is the beginning of the scouring of the Shire. But in reality, the Shire was already scoured, right? Have been obsessed with rules and modernism. We've become turned into a papers please country. We've, in Starmer's words, become an island of strangers because of demographic change. We're fatter, more dependent on the state. We're less well read, little historical memory, more heavily medicated. The list goes on. We're more depressed, and so if we're even if we were able to stop all the immigration flows to make us stop to make us or to stop us from becoming an island of strangers further, we are intellectually, morally, spiritually, culturally moribund. I think so.
Yeah.
You can contest that, but what do you think we'd actually need to do to restore the nation beyond the let's deal with the demographics?
Sure. I mean, I'm a bit more optimistic actually. I mean, I just wrote a long piece on this for an American audience, Frontier magazine, and responding to the kind of thing that one often sees online from Americans, like, "Oh, England has fallen," and so on.
Mm.
And I don't think that's true. I think, whilst I agree that all of those things are under attack, I grew up in Wiltshire, so I grew up in the Shire. I am a hobbit, and in many ways, although I did move to the city to study and stay there to work, and now I'm stuck here, at least for now. But yeah, I mean, and there is a concerted attempt to attack the farmers, to undermine country ways of life, and so on. And I think the spreadsheet mentality of the managerial class just doesn't understand that there is a difference between the country and the city, and sees everything this technocratic way. Oh, the
Mm,
countryside is just a place to exploit people for tax and to take the land and do what we like. And this is part of a bigger attack on the English working class, right? Which I think has been going on for
mm,
decades, and the total destruction of people's way of life. But I would say, look, English heritage and British heritage is extraordinary, right? We have some of the most beautiful countryside, the most incredible prehistory. I grew up around Avebury and Stonehenge and all of these places, and they're very, very powerful places, and they're not. It'd be very hard to destroy them, right? I don't think we can
mm,
pretend. There's an ineradicable spirit of place, and there is a heritage, there is a history. Yes, it's under siege, but it's still there. And all of these decisions around tax and immigration are political decisions, which also mean they can be different in the future, right? And I think one of
mm,
the things we've seen, like raise the colours and the flags, and people, as you said, identifying, working out their ancestors. Like the modern
mm,
people, like we're the only people who don't know where our ancestors are buried. I think this is a great tragedy,
mm,
like that we're cut off from, in the name of liberation, we're somehow cut off from these structures. And I don't think it's a surprise that English people and Welsh and Scottish and Irish people have really started to think about where they are, who they are as a people, what their history is, and it was always going to happen. I think if you want to see it as a backlash, I don't personally see it as a backlash, but if you say, well, everyone else is allowed to celebrate their culture and their identity and their
mm,
religion, but not you guys, for reasons that are, oh, because history, oh, because you're somehow guilty for whatever, even though obviously the vast majority of people are working class and recently peasants and so on, had nothing to do with these sort of elite decisions. And there is always a class war within the country. Like the elites treat the white working classes like, fodder in war, or people to be
mm,
exploited and to be demonized, and ideologically we've seen that. So I think that the reassertion of national identity and heritage and culture and all of those things is very, very positive, and it does tell us that we actually do have all that still, right? Even though it's clearly
mm,
under attack, right? And I don't agree that this idea that England has fallen, it's way too doom-pilled, it's way too,
mm,
depressing, and it's also not true. I think there is resistance, there is, okay, we're in a bad situation, not just because of mass immigration, but for many reasons, right? But
mm,
it's possible to remember what it is that we're fighting for, right? What it is that we love about our country and our heritage and our fellow British people, English people, or whatever we are. So
mm,
I think it's sort of both at the same time, to think about this destruction, but also what we actually have, which is enormous, right, and
mm.
priceless.
I'd agree. I'd agree, and I will. I will try to elucidate that. I am perhaps a little bit less black-pilled than my monologue might have suggested. I think that the Shire has certainly. There's been an attempted scouring by generations of the political class, and as you say, England endures, and we hope that it will continue to. And it's my fervent hope that there are enough of us out there thinking about this and trying to do something about it that and not just people in the political class, but as you say, there is this organic cultural tide swelling where there's clearly a hunger for the country to endure in some way, the people to endure. And so I want to see that happen. And I suppose it would be interesting to get your thoughts on. For example, we've seen Restore Britain, a Rupert Lowe-led
Mhm.
project, which now has lots of interesting people on the advisory board. And effectively, what they're trying to do is push the Overton window at the political class level to bring things on the agenda that otherwise wouldn't have been there. So we're talking about the cessation of mass immigration. We're talking about deportations, but there are other things in there. There's energy, there's a whole bunch of other policy levers, and
Mhm.
we've touched on it already. Lots of these things are policy based, but clearly what we seem to be getting at here is there's a moral and cultural and spiritual thing, and so maybe a restoration, which is always a kind of a bringing back, or a bringing back to the fore something that has really always been there, and we've tried something different which hasn't worked. Is I don't think it's all about policy. There's clearly something else, and so I used this
Mm.
analogy where um, with a previous guest, which is, the forging of England, which happened a bit after Alfred the Great, but he ultimately, in his nation building, after vanquishing the Danes, got people to go, look, we're all English now. We're marching under this flag. Dane and Saxon, forget about it. You're English, and here are the things that everyone needs to know. The things that are going to lead to a thriving civic environment and improve literacy and all the rest of it. So we're all part of the same thing, the same project, as you've spoken about. And I'm not really seeing much evidence of that at the moment. I want to know how the moral, the spiritual, the cultural restoration might begin, and not just the policy stuff, which is important, but it will only take us so far. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, it obviously going back to the Reformation. I mean, Britain is a pagan country, it's a Christian country, and it's a liberal country, right? But it's not a Muslim country. Let's make that clear. Within the Christian side of British history, there is, of course, the Reformation, and the Protestantism, which we could argue has maybe led to some of these ways of thinking. You know, there's all kinds of deep intellectual discussions about in post-liberalism and elsewhere about how we got to where we are, whether individualism and universalism sort of comes from Christianity or a particular kind of Christianity. I'm very good friends with a lot of very traditional Catholics. I'm not myself Catholic. I'm an Anglo-Catholic. I'm Anglo-Irish myself. I think this is, but I'm a recent convert, relatively speaking. You know, a few years now. Before that, I was a liberal subject. My parents were sort of atheistic. I mean, we're all still liberal subjects, but you know what I mean. I made a conscious decision to become baptized and to join the church, um, and it is complicated. There's no way around this. um, the Catholics I know think of England as a Catholic country. They still do,
Mm,
despite the Reformation. And obviously, the Catholics have been persecuted uh, over hundreds of years, and particularly around that time, the Church of England. Well, this we could go into to what that was. Um, but I think part of it is going to be a return to Christian values and Christianity. Of course, the church, particularly the Anglican Church, has left itself wide open to all kinds of ideological capture. And I think one thing you see among young people who are becoming interested in Christianity is a desperate desire for a way of life and a set of beliefs that are at odds with the world and the ideology of the institutions that they are otherwise part of.
mm,
And
mm,
sometimes there is a disappointment or a surprise when you go to a more liberal church and it just sounds like your university or it sounds like your workplace, you know, all the same sorts of ideas being pushed. And I think it's very interesting. This is also happening in France to note where people, especially young people, are, and especially young men, are drawn to, let's say, more orthodox, either the Orthodox Church or traditional Catholicism, rather than the more
mm,
liberalized versions of Christianity.
mm,
So I think re-Christianizing in one way or another is a part of this, and I would say that even the secular values of human rights and so on do have a Christian background, even if they've dispensed with God and Christ, and even if they, you know, it's gone somewhere else. And I think that's also part of our history that people are coming to understand that
mm,
even the response to Christianity in the form that it takes is Christian because we are a Christian country. Um,
mm,
and so partly that, I think there are certain norms around social and civic behavior that we have seen eroding, right? Just everyone notices things like people playing music on buses or whatever.
mm.
This is an everyday sort of example. And there is a great fatigue or tiredness with people not understanding or not obeying those social norms, and that would also go for native British people as well. Just a
Mhm.
sort of sense that what I want to do is the most important thing. But I think this we've reached a limit. We're many years, decades after the sexual revolution. Surely we've gone as far as we can with that. I mean, I think it's really uh significant that Louise Perry's book, for example, criticizing the sexual revolution, was such a hit because she
Mm.
really tapped into this recognition, actually, that sex and porn and all of those things are actually not uh, they're not the solution. They don't tell you who you are, actually. Like, these are actually things that we had social norms and religious ideas around those things for a good reason. And I think Christianity is also an anthropology. Of course, it is. It tells us who we are. It understands that we're all broken, that we're all tempted, that we all commit sin, and that we're all capable of deciding not to. Right? We can choose to change our behavior and how we are in the world and how we act through love and through our ties and our bonds and our duties to each other,
Mm.
or we could just selfish, atoms, like you say. And people have a choice, and people, I think, increasingly want to make that choice, whether they convert or whatever the word would be, revert or vert to Christianity or not. But that there is, I think, a desire for uh, more social norms, and not to be imposed in an authoritarian way, right? People sometimes worry about Catholic integralism as this sort of, oh, isn't this just Christian theocracy? I don't think there is a way we can go back to a fusion of church and state, nor do I think that would be uh, uh, desirable necessarily. So again, it's sort of
Mm.
like a moderate clawing back of the things that are still there just about, and that we do remember just about, or that we can excavate. Um, yeah.
Mm. Well, I'd like to riff off to at least to the ideas that you've put forward there, and one of them, I suppose, is the reclaiming some of the aspects that you just set out, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with the idea that whether we like it or not, culture is influenced and the direction of it is set by the elites, and as we and people may not always agree with that, but clearly that's got a thing. I mean, we can see even just recently Trump 2.0, all of a sudden, all of the policy changes that were turned on overnight changed things on approach to sustainability beyond other things, right? There are also lots of things happening, pull this out of the classroom, all that kind of stuff. And you see people respond to it even if they didn't want to. So there's clearly levers that can be pulled at the elite level. And I suppose if we're looking at the roiling turbulence that we're seeing in Britain, across the West, because of the difference between the rulers and the rules. It's the global goods, multicultural, you do you, non-judgmental culture, and that's gotten us into a pickle. No one particularly likes it. But what's interesting is you'll see some people who I actually find common cause with and are right about certain things, like James Marriott, who writes for The Times. He wrote an
Mm,
excellent article about being in a post-literate society and how who
mm,
knows if civilization is going to survive this. But he'll also mount a defense and say, look, I get that people don't like liberal elites, but we'll miss them when they're gone. I suppose my riff on your point, Nina, is the quality of the elite. So the things that we're going to claim clearly need
mm,
some elite direction because they're the ones who push the institutions that we all get formed through. My challenge to James would be is the liberal elites went a long time ago. The ones that were of high quality, that were well read, who understood the civilization, that they're gone. I mean, our prime minister doesn't dream, he doesn't have a favorite poem, he doesn't have a favorite book. And you could argue that the rest of the government are broadly the same. And these are the most important people in the land in some respect. And so, what prospects do we have of restoring a civilization when we have an elite class, I suppose, that almost have no concept of it, and they've been born in the the ashes of the new civilization, the ashes of the revolution. What do you think of that?
I think there is a pendulum swing. I mean, I agree with your description, and clearly it's like a cacocracy, like government by the worst,
Mm.
and all of the best people.
So good.
And I will say, if I could form a government in waiting of the people I know who are genuinely moral, intelligent, um, loving, thoughtful, conscientious people, I would do it immediately, right? But I think what's happened is that the people who would be good at governing have gone into jobs that are secure and make money, or they've left the country, and we're seeing that especially among young people. And this isn't good. I think we have to have a different way of understanding who we want in power. I mean, when I speak to some young, politically motivated people, men and women today, like in their 20s, a lot of them really do are give me a great hope, right? I don't want to be one of these middle-aged people who's like, "Oh, young people, the hope." But there is a sense that when I speak to them, they're extremely realistic. I think people want a politics that's based in truth. Truth does not go very well with politics in general. There are lots of things
Mm,
about the liberal order that required a lot of lying about a lot of things. And we know that the multicultural project was a god that required or seemed to require or demanded the sacrifice of white working class girls. That was a sacrifice that certain elites were prepared to pay. And as I say, the working class have been sacrificed over and over and over again by the elites uh,
mm,
for hundreds of years. And in this sense, I sort of probably still am in a strange way a kind of Marxist, although I wouldn't define myself this way. But that there is a class war that is being waged against normal people in this country on every
mm,
level. Um, I don't think people want to be global citizens. Honestly, I think people want to be local and national, and to feel proud of themselves, their lives, to have meaningful work and loving relationships and all of those sorts of things. So globalism doesn't work either. It works for a very small percentage of people who are sort of taking all the money, as they did during the lockdown as well. This massive wealth transfer upwards, um,
mm,
and yeah, so I mean, the question of how to train, how to breed almost a good ruling class, I mean, is something that the Greeks talk about, thousands of
mm,
years ago at this point. It's of intense importance. I know that there are projects like Civic Future and so on which are trying to do this, um, and to get people to have a stake in the future. I think we'll probably see the emergence of those kind of figures. And I have great
mm,
respect for people like Danny Kruger, for example, who
mhm,
are outspoken, who've now moved to reform. I have respect also for figures like Morris Glassman and the Blue Labour Project. I don't think it's necessarily um, feasible in some ways, but I do. It's important to have that. Like, ideally, you want a robust, educated, ruling elite that will disagree with each other, that will shape each other. Right? We don't
mm,
want. I personally do not want a technocratic, authoritarian global elite that is indifferent. As Starmer is explicitly, he says he cares more about Davos than Westminster, more about whatever the global elite than he does about his own country. Um, we want people with ties and a national feeling, and I
mm,
hope we will get it. But the structure is not really there for very easily for people to move into those positions, and that's something that has to change, I think.
I'd agree. As you're talking, uh, it's becoming clear in my head that you're probably the person with the worldview closest to my own that I've had on the show. It's quite interesting to hear you flipping between that kind of old left worldview frame, which is still
Mm.
important, whilst also nodding to the kind of the reformers with the kind of the populist side of things, I suppose. So it's been interesting hearing you speak. Oh, yeah, here's someone who mind seems to work in a similar way. Anyway, the other strand that I wanted to pull on was to do with re-Christianizing. So
Hmm.
I'm sure it wouldn't have escaped your attention as a very widely read person that um, probably in the last year and a half or so, when there's been a suggestion of wanting to re-Christianize, is that there are some who flagged the alarm and said, "Look, this is fraught with difficulties," and these are Christians who say it. So Paul Kingsnorth, very famous writer, Orthodox Christian, and Elizabeth Oldfield, she was also written and spoken similarly that they think there is a danger in this idea of designing a Christian civilization, which isn't what I'm saying you're positing, and that effectively we all need to individually come to Christ, and you can't force it upon people because it's going to turn into probably a theocracy. Um, in some ways, I can understand what they're saying because humans, institutions, power can often lead to large distortions and all the rest of it. That's just the nature of human institutions. But on the other side of things, I think, well, much of what made Britain Britain and each of its constituent nations was the fact that it was Christianized initially by either missionaries from Rome or by monks from Ulster. And they went out and won as many souls for Christ. And over time, institutions built and promulgated a classical Christian culture throughout the land, which became a part of who we are. It created our laws, it created the all of our political institutions, and so in many respects, I feel like, well, Christian civilization has worked when directed from above, and yes, it's been an organic growth, and maybe they're suggesting that we kind of need that to happen again. But to me, it feels like we have, as you've mentioned, all of the ingredients there. It's just we need someone to come along and effectively say, well, no, this is now part of, I don't know, the curriculum and what we do, which is let's try to inculcate all of this stuff that we know and all the rest of it. Do you think a Christian civilization directed by the elites can work, or are you more of the Kingsnorth Oldfield view of no, 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 that's just fraught with danger? People need to come naturally to the faith to re-Christianize a nation.
I mean, intuitively, the second position in a way, because that's right. I mean, it should come from below, as it were, and of course, you know, the history of Christianity in Britain is also one of the persecution of different groups at different times, generally the Catholics. Um, um, but it's, you know, and you might say, well, this is ludicrous. You're never going to get more than a few percent of people being actively Christian. You know, isn't it on the wane and continues to decline? I think there are pockets, as I say, of verting or reverting or converting um, to Christianity, which are very indicative and very hopeful, I think. And I went on pilgrimage with the Latin Mass Society earlier this year, and it was incredibly moving to see people
Mm,
so immersed in their faith and to understand England in this way as a Christian country. Um, and but but yes, I mean, but something like the recognition. I mean, what we had up until relatively recently was the recognition that Britain was a Christian country. I mean, the monarch is officially the head of the Church of England. We're still a nominally Christian country, actually. Um,
mm,
even if the secularism has sort of expanded to fill almost the entirety of what everybody does, and all the institutions are no longer pledging allegiance to God or so on. I mean, I went to primary school, a kind of normal primary school in Wiltshire, quite small, and there was a residual Christianity in the assembly stories, some of the parables. I was a brownie. There was a residual Christianity in some of
mm,
this. But it was very gentle and already I think had been quite liberalized. You know, we used the Common Praise songbook, which also had songs from the Beatles and more sort of
yeah.
generic kind of let's be nice to each other, rather than a kind of heavy emphasis on theology or anything like that. And it's funny
Mm,
in my middle age to now be trying to get to grips with theology and scripture that other generations for hundreds of years would have known, would have been taught and read at home and so on. So there is something a little bit postmodern about being Christian in modernity, I think. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's so, but I think to say, even if we don't go down the kind of Christianity from above route, it would be to say, well, look at our history, look at who we are. We are the product of this, and actually, post 60s, this is the blip, perhaps. You know that actually we are far more pagan and Christian. We were pagan and Christian for a lot longer than we were liberal. And if liberalism is somehow moving to something else or becoming a different version of itself, um, that's the short-lived thing. And actually, the reality of human existence and civilizations is religious, fundamentally. That human beings are fundamentally religious. And if we say that we're not, we immediately invent new religions or cults. We can't help it. We're cultic. We're religious, and some of the new cults are extremely dangerous, and they promulgate things that are simply false, and not only false but dangerous and destructive. And I would very much include the mutilation of children in the name of the fantasy that you can change sex. So this is a really obvious one that caused people a lot of problems to defend over the last decade. But I think we're seeing even among people who kept their mouths shut for 10 years, whilst others of us were severely punished for stating the reality of sexual difference, and saying that this is meaningful and has should have consequences for the way that we collectively organize ourselves. And it's ineradicable, and we can't change these things. Instead, we had a kind of cult of compassion, faux compassion. It's very difficult. Everyone's trying to give a history of the present at the moment. You know, always it's very difficult to give an account of the present. But lots of things are going on. People talk about suicidal empathy. Not sure it was empathy. There was all kinds of status games. Again, this sort of elite discourse. It's like, how can you prove that your loyalty oath to your own class and the loyalty oaths that people were being required to swear were mad and horrible and wrong. But then if you noticed and if you pointed this out, of course you were scapegoated, you were sacrificed, and accused of being hateful and awful and all kinds of things. So we need a realistic anthropology that informs our politics, I think.
Yes. Well, let's take it a little bit further. Let's imagine a thought experiment in which we're seeing a kind of re-Christianising, whether it's making sure people are actually aware of history and heritage and all the rest of it, or whether we're going for the full fat, people are being dragged through to the services and learning the old school hymns and all the rest of it and the key figures. And we look at that in comparison to where we're at today, which is, as I've already implied, there's a non-judgmental culture, but a morally relativistic culture. So we do the all religions thing, and we don't recognize theological differences. So, for instance, people will, in the name of inclusion, want to make Muslims feel welcome. And they will do it in all sorts of ways in the corporate world. They will allow, in the lead up to Eid, people to effectively evangelize on behalf of Islam, thinking, well, there's no harm with this. I mean, all religions are the same. And we, being the professional managerial class, don't really believe any of it's true anyway. So we'll just give everyone the chance to speak about it. We'll probably keep the Christians in the back, but Muslims can definitely have their day. We can have some we can do a little bit on Diwali because that's quite fun. We get a lot of colour being brought to the day and all the rest of it, but don't really believe it. If we imagine a scenario where we're going, look, we're actually going to push on with, we're rediscovering the heritage of the country, and as you said, that does not include the other religions, insofar as that's not what built the country. Do you think we actually need to start moving to a bit of a, I'm sorry, but this is just the way it is? We recognize you have your religion, you can believe what you want, but we can't have a kind of muscling in on the public space from other religions. Do you think other religions are, in the name of kind of an ecumenical worldview, kind of morally relativistic worldview, are afforded too much space to shape the culture, and that if we're going to actually rediscover the Christian heritage, that it needs to be a kind of bolder and prouder, this is what it is about, and you either take it or leave it? Because at the moment, I don't
Yeah.
see anyone wanting to actually grapple with the idea that Islam, for example, just immediately sucks in Judaism and Christianity as, by the way, just so you know, this is the one true religion, and everything that went before was either fake or was really just a lead up to this. And so there's a supremacy built in that. Do you think we're going to have to start grappling with that and stop hiding behind it because it's not going to go away?
Yes, and I realise that people don't want to do this because they're scared, and nobody wants to be accused of being intolerant or racist, and these words have been kind of thrown at people as a way of stopping this discussion for decades, right? Um, I first of all, I want to say that I think the liberal atheist position, oh, it doesn't really matter, it's just a few people or whatever, is intensely disrespectful and actually racist. I think that's the racist position because it disavows or it denies the fact that people actually have extremely different worldviews, and that people take their
Mm,
religion and their the way they see things very, very, very seriously. And it sort of pretends that they don't, or it seeks to ignore the fact that there are huge contradictions. I mean, it's why you can have like queers for Palestine, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Um, there are deep differences in the way people see the world. We first of all we have to acknowledge that, and actually to give respect, if you like, to the fact that people do see the world very differently, and trying to combine a post-sexual revolution liberal society with people who think that women should wear the niqab or the chador, um, and think that homosexuals should be stoned to death, is a problem. There is clearly a vast divide between those two outlooks. And
mm,
secondarily, there are many Muslim countries, there are more than 50 Muslim countries in the world. Um, Islam in particular is a warlike colonizing religion by definition, right? And that's what it is. That's how it sees itself. Um, it has ideas about uh, colonizing and the caliphate and so on, and the ummah, which are distinctly at odds with the preservation of Christian and Western cultures. I think it uh, these are sort of hard truths. I don't know what to say. I mean, unless we're going to die of politeness and say, well, okay, we'll well, you know, you do you. We'll just, you know, carry on. Um, we're in trouble, and we've seen this already. It leads to huge conflict. It leads to violence. It leads to, um, you know, extreme acts of terror, and so on. And I think that idea that we should accept that because we should feel guilty because of previous decisions made by governments around war, or that we should accept that because we're somehow ontologically evil because of colonialism. Right? No, I think people are saying absolutely not. We've had enough of this. Like, why should we be unsafe in our own country? Why should we be deferential to other religions? You mentioned briefly that Christianity in Britain gets a raw deal, and I completely agree. I sit on a panel called CDAC, which is looking at the persecution of Christians in public life, and many of the stories are
mm,
not public. We know about various cases where people have been arrested for praying outside abortion clinics and so on. Um, but there are many more stories that are private, not public domain, where people have lost their jobs for expressing Christian beliefs, mainstream Christian beliefs in their workplace or online, and have lost work and been ostracized, and so on and so forth. And this is happening very asymmetrically towards Christians. Um, and it's almost like, well, you're allowed to laugh and mock Christians, you're allowed to sort of treat them badly. Um, but you can't do that to Muslims or any other group, right? And I personally would repeal all hate speech legislation. I think we have ended up with terrible laws, and I think a lot of the laws we have are the problem because we can't then roll them back, well, we can, but I mean, we can't do anything as they stand, if you see what I mean. Like everyone is operating within those laws or abusing them in some ways, but
Mm,
applying them. But they are fundamentally unfair um, and unjust, I would say. Um,
mm.
we should be able to criticize other religions, for example, without fear of violence or persecution on the basis of hate speech and so on.
Well, we've spoken quite a lot about distance between rulers and ruled. We've spoken a lot about people wanting to be attached to the local and the national. We talked about heritage and history and how ultimately all of that is returning to the fore in some way. At least organically, people want it. Whether they're getting it or not, or whether they will get it or not, is probably the question we should ask. So if we start looking at how much the Overton window has shifted with regards to criticism of various things. So I think we can safely say that mass immigration, that Overton window has been shattered, even though people are still trying containment in some way. You'll find a Rory Stewart or whoever else saying that people see all these problems and they just come up with a really simple answer: fascism. And they're still going down the smear approach, but the reality is no one's allowing it to stick anymore. But people just keep pushing, saying, no, we need to deal with that. We need to stop it. We're seeing people talk openly, including members of the parliament, about a remigration program of sorts. And you've spoken about how we've been under the technocratic spell for a long time. You know, this rule by kind of third party organizations and a distant expert class who are ruling by spreadsheet. I suppose what the thought experiment I'll put with you, or not thought experiment, but the question is do you envisage a future where we move past those things? So do you envisage a future where our political governance changes, where we do actually see the end of mass immigration, where we do actually see some kind of remigration, where we do actually see the end of technocracy? I mean, what would even that look like? We're so used to management by spreadsheet and management by committee and 5-year plans and supranational bodies. What if you were to have a crystal ball, and I'm sorry for setting you up on the prediction front here, but where do you think we're going on any or all or other issues?
Well, I think, all empires fall, right? So I
Mm,
think probably what's more likely from my perspective would be something like a collapse of some kind, probably economic. Um, and that there would have to be, by necessity, a reform of the welfare state, because clearly that's untenable. It's unaffordable.
mm,
We have, like, huge debt and almost, virtually no growth and productivity and so on. And I'm not a free market absolutist, and I'm not an economist, but clearly there's something unsustainable about a world in a country or world in which people are dependent upon other people making money. Whilst those people are being taxed more and more and more. I mean, they're just going to leave. They are leaving. Um,
mm,
so I think we'll probably see some kind of collapse. I would personally rather live in a poorer but optimistic country that sees itself as part of a collective endeavor to rebuild itself. I'm fully in favor of a sort of artisanal economy in many ways, that we make things and so on. Um, I don't know about full Butlerian jihad, or a sort of Ted K solution to technology. I mean, obviously, everything depends upon electricity and so on, and energy. There's sort of huge energy questions. Again, not my area, but um, I think there will be some collapse. I'm not sure about the civil war hypothesis. I mean, this is a thing that's sort of being
mm,
circulated. I think we'll just see more and more skirmishes and horrible events and things like that. And I think it will seem increasingly untenable. And I agree about the Overton window. It's clear that people are talking about things that even 2 years ago were verboten. You'd get accused of being Hitler if you even noted them. You'd be the one who sounded evil and mad and obsessed if you mentioned certain things. Um, and now I think that's shifting, even at sort of fancy dinner parties. Um, I think people can see the hypocrisy increasingly of the elites who are all like, oh, multiculturalism for thee, but not for me. Oh, I live in my
mm,
nice house in the middle of a white area, and what's your problem? You know, why aren't you okay with like huge numbers sort of fighting age men in asylum centers in your small village? Like, what's wrong with you? So I
Mm,
think people can see that kind of hypocrisy more and more, and they're pointing it out. And it's almost so I do think that there is a political solution. It doesn't have to be horrible either, right? I mean, of course, there's going to have to be some decisions made, but things can be done carefully and gently, and I don't see why it's not beyond the wit of collective humanity at the global scale. It's 2025 that we can't help countries rebuild, that people can't, why can't people live in a nice way in places where their ancestors and their culture and flourish there, right? Like why
mm,
this idea that the West or wherever needs to exhibit infinity charity to everyone else is also not possible. It's not fair and it's not possible. It's not fair on people who
mm,
live there, and we've seen countries like Denmark, right? So as far as I understand it, under a left-wing government,
mm,
they have um, uh, slowly and carefully remigrated people, and with the support of the country. Um, so things are possible. It's not it's not impossible, and it wouldn't necessarily mean everyone. I mean, I'm friends with large numbers of assimilated people, if you like, people who are totally committed to British values and work hard and all of that. And so, of course, you're going to have to make sort of fine-grained distinctions. And of course, this
mm,
is going to maybe look cruel to the liberal whose heart is overflowing with their own desire to be thought of as a good person. And I admit I struggle with this. I struggled with thoughts that I was being cruel when I said human beings can't change sex. I thought for a year before I said anything, I thought, am I being cruel? Am I being unkind? And I think everybody has those thoughts, but really there's a form of kindness which is much more cruel, actually, ultimately.
mm,
There is
mm,
the road, the sort of, um, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
mm.
And I think there is a way
Yes.
of making life livable for the greatest number of people. I'm not a utilitarian, by the way, but we can, with our collective wit and uh, sort of engineering skills and all those things, rebuild the world, um, put people who live here, who come from here first. Um, but it isn't our job, and it's not possible to look after everybody. We can't do it. It's an unsustainable situation. So I think we will see something like an economic collapse, which would then lead to tough political decisions around welfare. I imagine we would have to leave the European Convention on Human Rights at some point, um, and things like that. But it doesn't have to be horrible, It doesn't have to be cruel,
Mm,
I hope.
mm. Yes, yeah, that's definitely the fervent hope. But as far as I can see, the people who are actually working on things like deportation, remigration, whatever you want to call it, they're trying to follow that similar lead of the Danes and the Swiss and all the rest of it, which is it's humane. Um, it's pulling on levers rather than sending in the crack squad and tearing people out and all the rest of it. But I think what is interesting about what you're saying um, is that should an economic collapse come, which it probably will, given the state of things, as you've already pointed out, is that it's in those moments where the delusions of grandeur and the ideological projects die almost immediately amongst most who kind of tenuously believed in them. And I call to mind a book which I learned about through John Gray, funnily enough. I think he was on some other podcast and he referenced it. And it was a book written, I can't remember by the journalist. I think his surname might have been Lyons, and it's not a pseudonym, but it was called The Assignment in Utopia, and it was him being previously very committed as a left-wing person, went over to the Soviet Union and saw the state of Ukraine and people cannibalizing one another, and effectively it being a little bit like that Hobbes state of nature, all against all. And clearly, if you've got a whole bunch of people who are divided by ethnic lines and divided in such a way that they're not committed to the same project. So they're placing their ethnic interests above others, or religious lines, or all the rest of it. That you can envisage a scenario if, Bank of England goes kaput, government goes kaput, suddenly the City of London, which we've centralised everything to whilst getting rid of everything else, just continues to fail and sputter. And as I think someone referred to it online, just becomes a bit of a modern day Mogadishu. You could kind of see this happening, right? Because people are already pointing at each other and casting accusations from various angles about preferential treatment. Well, that's only going to amplify when there are fewer resources to go after. So I'm also with you. I'm not too sure about the Civil War thing, though I do see there being a bit of a South Africanization of the country, people retreating in their own little
Mhm.
blocks and it just becoming an unworkable state. Nina, clearly we could talk forever, but I want to be respectful of your time and at least ask you what one of the questions that we have remaining, and maybe we can pick up another time because it'd be wonderful to do so. Um, the question is, which I ask all of my guests, is what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life? Maybe it was some absolute that you thought was unshakable. Maybe it was something more day to day, but it felt consequential. And what was it that made you change your mind?
It was interesting. I like this question, and you put a version of it in the email, and I was thinking about it ahead of this discussion, and the thing that came to mind actually was I suppose the thing that I have changed my mind about is immediately believing people who tell you that they're very upset or that they are the victim.
Hmm.
This is the thing that I've changed my mind on. I was a sort of pathological lefty for a long time, but an old lefty, and uh, I think we saw our enemy, if you like, as parts of the state, the prisons, and so on. I was very involved in the student movement and defending protesters and the right to protest and so on. And our enemies were not each other, right? It was the structure of punishment and other things where people were being unfairly penalized for their views. And in that sense, it's interesting. I feel like I've always wanted to defend freedom of expression and freedom of association, which are rights. But now I defend them primarily for Christian belief. But for me, there's a continuation in my defense of these freedoms, actually, even though they might look different sort of superficially. But I think one thing that started to happen around 2013 or something, just in my recollection, was uh, this sort of sudden demand for of different groups, new groups often, for not just recognition, but kind of domination, and the idea that people must bow down to them. And there was a lot of cry bullying, a lot of, we're going to punish you if you don't go along with this. And um, I initially I thought, well, these people seem upset about something. They must have a reason to be upset, and we obviously want to help people who are upset because they're having a bad time.
Hmm.
And I really had to get over this because it wasn't true. I think that kind of self-victimizing or using supposed victimhood as a way of getting what you want is not
Hmm.
it's not democratic. It's not uh, it's not fair and it's not true. And I think we all have to live together, and that means treating each other as adults. So it's almost like everybody has to grow up, including myself. I'm a very immature person in many ways, and I struggle with this all the time. But I would say also to myself to not give in to self-pity, victimhood, trying to get what you want by saying, I'm really upset or I'm offended or I'm being oppressed or whatever. Like
Hmm.
that's the thing I've changed my mind on in the broad sense. I'm very trusting. I'm very open. This has caused me a lot of problems, and I'm not saying this to make myself sound good. I think it's actually a flaw. It's a failing of character, and has caused all kinds of issues. But I think to be pragmatic and to be realistic and um, to to get beyond emotivism, really, which is something that McIntyre
Mm,
diagnoses quite well as what is coming down the pipeline in the early 80s. He said, our politics has basically become emotivism. People are just sort of shouting over each other for their feelings. I feel this, therefore it's true. And I'm much more interested in what's true rather than even if that truth is painful. And I think a lot of truth is painful, is uncomfortable. We don't like it. We seek to avoid it. There's that T.S. Eliot quote, mankind cannot bear very much reality. The
mm,
more we know, the more we suffer. That's also in the Bible. Suffering knowledge brings kind of a suffering, kind of grief, when we can no longer pretend that we don't know certain things. Um, so I think I've changed my mind on uh emotion perhaps, and I've changed my mind on thinking that actually being mature and being a responsible person is actually a very good thing, and in fact we need an entire society built around responsible people doing normal things, and thinking of others, to have any kind of workable society. We cannot just have everyone running off and doing their own thing and then screaming when they don't get what they want. So I think I've
mm.
changed my mind on maturity. I think maturity is a good thing, and we shouldn't be immediately swayed by emotional appeals. I suppose it's not to say that people don't suffer. By the way, I'm not sadist. I absolutely, people suffer, terrible things happen, but as we've seen, some victimhood is more important than others in the current ideological situation. And in fact, some of the people who've suffered the most have been attacked, or ignored or multiply punished, particularly around the
Mm.
rape gangs and so on. Just these people have been seen as a problem. The victims of these things have been seen as a problem, when in fact they were really genuinely victims. So
Mm.
I suspicion of the politics of victimhood. I could have said that in a
Yeah.
much more succinct way.
No, no, no. You don't
Sorry.
ever have to apologize about a long answer. I'm the king of them. But it was uh, it made me it did make me reflect on something you said earlier about all empires must fall. And without wanting to set you off on a huge rabbit warren and have you late for other appointments, is the empire of the mind that seems to have been built, which people have spotted, has been through the therapeutic culture, which Philip Reef wrote about, and lots of other people have started to talk about, which is therapy talk is everywhere in the culture. And again, people suffer and people need help, and not dismissing that. But it is interesting to watch how, in just everyday conversation, that people now refer to themselves in very therapeutic terms and are always pathologizing everyday problems. And it does weaken them in some way, but also it totally removes agency from them. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying that everyone of these kind of has the ability to be some ubermensch who just has the ultimate agency over absolutely everything. Clearly, we're connected to other people. Sociological things do exist and do impact us, but we do have agency. We can respond to things. We can live in accordance with whatever set of morals we want and virtue ethics or whatever you want to call it. Um, I wonder, do you see, because the therapy culture is quite literally everywhere, and you find it in the corporate world, you
Mhm.
find it on TV, you find it wherever you look, it's there. The glossy mags on the shelf and the newsagents. Do you see society tiring of it in some way of this kind of blase navel gazing, or do you think we just can't get enough of our own supposed troubles?
I think I agree about the dominance. I think it is waning. I mean, largely because it doesn't work, and in fact, the more people think they're victims, the more they're trapped in uh, thinking that. Right? It's very hard to get out of it
Mm,
if you somehow embrace it and you get stuck there. And there's an entire economy of keeping people stuck in that position, which is the ultimate cruelty. Actually, I mean, this is unbelievably cruel in the name of kindness, as I said already. But like we've created unbelievable cruelties, things much worse, unimaginable cruelty actually, to say to people, "Oh yes, you're a victim, and you must always be a victim," and so on. This is a terrible thing to do. And I think therapy is a god to replace Christianity, which does say actually, Christ is the only true victim, and your suffering, whilst is meaningful and real, is must be put in the context of Christ's suffering, right? We collectively, as a mob, as a people, we killed Christ, the only man to have ever lived without sin, right? We're all sinful. That's the other thing. And indeed, we
mm,
it precisely do have agency. We make decisions all the time. Um, and actually keeping people in a state of self-pity and victimhood is disastrous. And I think there are other models of how to get out of that. And I do this in my own life. I did this in my own life to get out of those that feeling and that position, which is ultimately very isolating. You feel incredibly alone. It's a horrible place to be. Um,
mm,
this isn't accurate. This is not anthropologically correct. It's not religiously correct. It does extreme damage, and actually we do have a choice, and we can decide not to do the things that harm us and other people, and we can get help. I mean, getting help is a good thing, right?
mm,
It can't be that you just stay there, right? We want people to get better. We want people to have meaning in their life. We want people to be able to help other people. And in order to help other people, you have to fix yourself first. You cannot really
mm.
do anything. So I think, if we want to say charity starts at home, yes, with your immediate family and people around you and your community, but also with yourself, right? It's like, and actually what turns out to be charitable in that sense is not self-indulgence, but saying, I don't have to keep doing these things that are harmful. There's
Mm.
no inevitability about
Here,
it.
mm.
Yeah.
No, here. I, um, I can't add anything else to it. I will end up just playing back your own words to them, but to you, but much less eloquently. Uh, Nina, I've kept you an awfully long time. Before I let you
It's fine.
go,
I'm
where
rather
can people?
I'm
Yeah.
rather underemployed at the moment, so it's fine.
Well, hopefully this opens up some new employment
If
opportunities
anyone would
for you
like to offer
somewhere
me
along the
a
line.
job, I have all kinds of skills, I promise, probably.
Well, Lena, where can people find you in the dark corners of the internet, and what can we expect from you next? I know you do quite a lot of interesting events and lecture series and all the rest of it. Tell people about your body of work and what we can expect from you.
Yeah, so I mean, I really should be writing another book, but I will get to that eventually. But I have a Substack. It's just my name. I'm on X. I do teach. I'm teaching a philosophy of history course at the moment in this very post-academic, para-academic world, which is very exciting. People doing things for themselves, reading books that you wouldn't find at university, and that kind of thing. At Verdurin, which is a place run by my friend Pierre in East London. I would strongly recommend anyone who's sort of open-minded and intellectually curious to come to some events there. We put loads of different things on, talks and workshops and readings and courses and stuff. So that's very positive. Um, yeah, I mean, I write for lots of different places sometimes, and I'm around.
Well, yes, you are certainly around. I encourage everyone to check out all of the places that they can find you on the internet. I also notice you do relatively regular podcasts with Louise Perry, Maiden Mother Matriarch, excellent podcast, and you always get into very interesting discussions. And you also have your own podcast, so we'll make sure we link to all of those in the show notes. But Nina, thank you very, very much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been one of my most enjoyable conversations, and I hope we get to do it again. And
Yeah.
yeah, I wish you all the best.
Ah, thank you, John.
Thank you.